In the waiting room, my brother said, "Don't mention Dad's name." I pressed record on my phone, and that's when I realized just how far things had fallen between us. It wasn't a loud demand, nor even a whisper. It was flat, measured, as if he had practiced saying it in his car mirror on the way here. He didn't look at me either, his eyes stayed fixed on the empty reception desk, on the stack of outdated magazines nobody ever touched. The waiting room was nearly silent, just the faint whir of the ceiling fan overhead and the occasional shuffle of shoes across the polished linoleum floor. But his words landed heavier than any sound in that space. "Don't mention Dad's name." The syllables clung to me, cold and foreign. My thumb hovered over the red button on my phone's screen, the recorder app glowing faintly like a secret I wasn't sure I had permission to keep. I pressed it anyway. The tiny icon spun, recording the hum of that fan, the low murmur of people at the far end of the hallway, and most of all, the tremor in my breath that I tried to swallow down. I wanted to ask him why. Why Dad's name had suddenly become taboo. Why the man who raised us, whose ghost was still heavy in every corner of our lives, was now treated like a curse word. But I didn't. Instead, I leaned back in the chair with its hard plastic arms, and I stared at the floor tiles, every square reflecting a different shade of yellow light. My brother, Daniel, crossed his legs and adjusted his tie like we were in some courtroom instead of a hospital. His posture was perfect, his jaw tight, his hands resting neatly in his lap. He had always been like this, precise, contained, careful with his words. But this was different. This was not carefulness, it was erasure. For a long stretch, neither of us spoke. The receptionist finally returned, shuffled a few papers, and glanced up, asking us to wait just a little longer before we'd be called in. I nodded out of habit, Daniel gave her that tight corporate smile, and then we were back in silence. It wasn't just silence, though. It was the silence that carries weight. The kind that makes your ears ring because underneath it are all the things you know should be said but aren't. I rubbed the smooth edge of my phone, watching the screen dim but not daring to stop the recording. Something in me knew I needed proof, not of his words, exactly, but of the way they sounded. How casually he had thrown them at me, as though he were asking me to pass the salt. "Why not?" I finally asked. My voice cracked at the end, betraying more than I wanted. Daniel's eyes flicked to me for the first time. They were sharp, impatient. "Because it complicates things. We're here to talk about Mom, not about him. Him. Not Dad. Just him." I felt my stomach tighten. Complicates things how? He sighed like I was a child asking endless questions on a road trip. "Because Mom doesn't need to hear about him right now. It'll only upset her." That was the excuse. But I could see in the stiffness of his shoulders, in the way his lips pressed together, that it wasn't really about Mom. It was about him, about Daniel. About what he wanted kept buried. I didn't push further. Not yet. Because Mom was just down the hall, lying in a hospital bed, and I didn't know what state she'd be in when we walked in. The last thing I wanted was to make a scene before we even saw her. But I also knew this conversation wasn't over. The waiting room clock ticked, a cheap round thing with faded numbers, and I counted the seconds until the nurse finally appeared. She called our names, and both of us stood at once, our chairs scraping across the floor. Daniel adjusted his tie again, always the tie, and walked ahead as if he were leading the way into a board meeting. I followed, phone in hand, the recording still going. When we stepped into Mom's room, the air shifted. It was cooler, softer, filled with the steady beep of monitors and the faint floral scent of the flowers someone else had left on the windowsill. Mom looked smaller than I remembered, though it had only been a week since I last saw her. Her hair was thinner, her hands pale against the white sheets, but her eyes brightened when she saw us. "Daniel. Sarah." Her voice was fragile but warm, like a candle still holding flame. Daniel leaned down first, kissing her cheek with practiced gentleness. He said all the right things, how she looked better, how he'd brought her some fresh fruit, how the doctors were optimistic. I waited until he was done before I stepped closer. I took her hand, holding it carefully as if it might break. "Hi, Mom," I whispered. She squeezed weakly, and in that moment, I felt all the years of her strength, her stubbornness, her love, even if her body was frail now. For a while, we all talked about safe things. The weather. The flowers. The food she'd been eating. I let Daniel take the lead, because he always did, and because he liked to control the narrative. But then Mom asked, in that quiet way only she could, "Have either of you been by the house lately?" "I've been thinking about your father's things." The pause in the room was heavy. Daniel's shoulders stiffened immediately. His smile froze. And before I could even open my mouth, he cut in. "We don't need to talk about that right now, Mom. Just focus on getting better." The dismissal was sharp, like a blade cutting off her words midair. I watched her face fall just slightly, the flicker of light in her eyes dimming. She nodded, but she didn't look at Daniel anymore. She looked at me. And in that look, I heard everything she hadn't said. That was when I knew that Dad's name wasn't just being silenced in this waiting room or this hospital. It was being erased entirely, swept aside by Daniel's insistence that the past was inconvenient. And Mom, too tired to fight, was letting it happen. I pressed my thumb over the side of my phone, feeling the vibration as the recorder kept running in my pocket. That night, after we left the hospital, Daniel barely said goodbye. He walked quickly to his car, unlocking it with a click and sliding in without so much as a glance back at me. I stood by my own car for a moment, staring at his taillights as they disappeared down the street, wondering when exactly my brother had become someone I didn't recognize. At home, I replayed the recording. Not the whole thing, just the first part. The part in the waiting room where he said, "Don't mention Dad's name." I listened to it again and again, the flatness of his voice, the absence of hesitation. Each time I heard it, something inside me hardened. I thought of Dad. His laugh, rough and warm. The way he'd sit on the back porch with a mug of coffee, staring at the horizon like it held all the answers. The way he'd call me kiddo, even when I was too old for it. He had been complicated, yes, not perfect, not easy, but he was ours. He was mine. And now, according to Daniel, he was no one. The injustice of it burned in me, but underneath that fire was something quieter, a resolve. I didn't know yet how, but I wasn't going to let Dad's name vanish from our lives like smoke in the air. Not for Daniel. Not for anyone. As I sat at the kitchen table with the glow of the phone screen in front of me, I whispered aloud, just to the empty room, "Dad." And in that moment, I knew the fight had only just begun. The next morning, I woke up with the recording still on my mind. It felt like a stone lodged in my chest. I hadn't planned on keeping it, but I also couldn't bring myself to delete it. There was something about having proof, even of a single sentence, that gave me a strange comfort. Proof that I wasn't imagining things. Proof that Daniel's dismissal of Dad wasn't just in my head. I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of lukewarm coffee, staring at the steam curling upward until it disappeared. The house was quiet, too quiet. Ever since Dad passed, silence had a way of stretching longer than it should, as though the walls themselves were waiting for his voice to break it. I glanced at the small shelf above the fridge where I had kept one of his old radios. It hadn't worked for years, but he loved fiddling with it. Sometimes, late at night, I'd catch him tuning the dial, trying to pull voices out of static. "You never know what you'll find," he used to say. Now it sat there gathering dust, a relic of his curiosity. Daniel would have thrown it away by now. That thought tightened something inside me. He was already discarding Dad's name, and soon, I feared, he'd start discarding the objects too, the memories, until nothing was left. The phone buzzed on the table. A text from Daniel, "Meeting with the lawyer tomorrow at 2. Be there." No please, no are you free, just a command. I stared at it for a while before replying, "I'll be there." I didn't tell him I already planned to bring the recording. Not to play it yet, but just to keep it close, like a weapon I wasn't sure I would use. When I visited Mom that afternoon, she looked brighter, as though a good night's rest had lifted some of the heaviness. She was propped up on pillows, reading the paper with her glasses low on her nose. "Hi, sweetheart," she said as I walked in. I sat beside her bed and pulled the chair close. "How are you feeling?" "Better," she said. "Tired, but better. The doctor thinks I might be able to go home in a few days." "That's good news," I smiled, though I noticed the tremor in her hands as she turned the page. We talked about simple things again, the neighbor's dog, the nurse who kept mispronouncing her name, the meal she wanted to cook once she was back home. But then her voice grew softer. "Have you been back to the house?" she asked. I hesitated. "Not since last week." Her eyes lifted to mine. "I keep thinking about the study. About your father's books. He loved that room." I swallowed. "He did." She nodded slowly, her eyes drifting back down to the paper, though I could tell she wasn't reading. "Don't let your brother throw them away." The words landed with such quiet weight that I almost missed them. She hadn't said if he would, only don't let him. As though she already knew what Daniel intended. "I won't," I promised, though my voice was barely audible. When I left the hospital, the sky was gray, heavy with the promise of rain. I drove by the old house instead of going straight home. The lawn was overgrown, and the shutters on the porch rattled in the wind. It looked abandoned, though inside I knew every corner was filled with Dad's presence. I parked but didn't go in. Not yet. I sat in the car, hands on the steering wheel, staring at the front door. Memories pressed against me, Dad carrying groceries inside, Dad sanding the porch rail, Dad standing in that doorway with his arms crossed, waiting for me to come home past curfew. It was unbearable and comforting all at once. The rain started then, soft at first, then heavier. I let it drum on the roof of the car, the windshield wipers beating in time with my thoughts. I didn't go inside, but I promised myself I would soon. Before Daniel did. The next day at the lawyer's office, Daniel was already seated when I arrived. He had a folder open, papers neatly arranged, his pen aligned perfectly on the table. He looked up when I walked in, his expression brisk. "You're late," he said. "By 2 minutes," I replied. He didn't answer. The lawyer, a tired-looking man in his 50s with thinning hair, shuffled through some documents. "We're here to discuss your mother's care plan and the estate matters moving forward," he began. I nodded, listening carefully, but my eyes kept flicking to Daniel. He was calm, collected, nodding at all the right times. But there was something in his calmness that unsettled me, as though he had rehearsed every line he planned to deliver. When the lawyer asked about the house, Daniel spoke first. "We'll sell it. It's too much upkeep. Mom can't manage it anymore, and neither can we." I felt heat rush to my face. "Sell it?" "Yes," he said smoothly. "It makes sense financially. We can move her into a smaller place, closer to medical facilities. The house is old, it'll just deteriorate." "But it's Dad's house," I blurted. The silence that followed was sharp. The lawyer shifted uncomfortably, glancing between us. Daniel's eyes narrowed. "We're not bringing him into this." I leaned forward, my voice low but firm. "It's his house. His books, his things. We can't just erase him." Daniel's jaw tightened. "We're not erasing anything. We're being practical." The lawyer cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should focus on what your mother wants?" I turned to him quickly. "Exactly. She wants to keep Dad's books, at least. She told me." Daniel's expression flickered, just for a moment, but then he recovered. "She's not in a state to make long-term decisions." I wanted to scream. Instead, I reached into my bag and felt the weight of my phone. The recording was there. Proof. But I didn't take it out. Not yet. When the meeting ended, Daniel gathered his papers briskly and stood. This isn't about sentiment, Sarah. It's about responsibility. I stared at him, my hands clenched. Responsibility doesn't mean forgetting. He didn't reply. He just walked out, the door clicking shut behind him. I sat there for a long time after he left, the lawyer politely excusing himself, until I was alone in the conference room. The air was stale, the clock ticking too loudly, but in that emptiness, I made another silent promise: I wouldn't let Daniel bury Dad twice. That night, I finally went into the house. The key turned stiffly in the lock, and the door creaked as I pushed it open. The smell hit me first, that mix of old wood, dust, and faint tobacco that still lingered from Dad's pipes. The air was thick, unmoved for weeks, but it was familiar. It wrapped around me like a blanket. I walked through each room slowly, touching the furniture, the photographs on the walls, the worn carpet. In the study, I ran my fingers across the spines of Dad's books. Some leaned precariously, some thick with dust, but they were still there. His notes, his handwriting in the margins, his life in ink and paper. I sank into his old armchair, the leather cracked but sturdy, and I closed my eyes. I could almost hear him humming under his breath, the way he used to when he worked at the desk. In that moment, I knew. This wasn't just about books or furniture or property. This was about memory. About history. About who we were allowed to be connected to. Daniel wanted to strip that away, but I wasn't going to let him. I opened my phone and started a new recording. My voice shook, but I spoke anyway. "Dad," I said into the quiet room. "This is me. I'm not letting them forget you." The silence answered back, heavy but steady, as though the house itself was listening. When I left the house that night, the sky had cleared after the rain. The air smelled of damp earth and wet leaves, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something close to steady. My shoes were muddy, my hair damp, but I carried with me the sense that Dad's presence was still intact. That Daniel hadn't yet managed to wipe him out completely. But the peace didn't last. The next morning, Daniel called. His tone was clipped, efficient, like he was speaking to a client rather than his sister. "I went by the hospital early today," he said. "Mom's asking for you." She seemed unsettled. Unsettled how? I asked, my hand tightening around the phone. "She keeps bringing up the past. Asking questions. It's not good for her recovery. Just keep her calm when you visit." I didn't answer right away. I could picture him standing there in his press suit, smoothing over every difficult edge of life as though people's memories could be managed like spreadsheets. "All right," I finally said, though the word tasted sour. At the hospital, Mom was sitting upright, her hair brushed neatly, her eyes clearer than I'd seen in days. She smiled when she saw me, but there was a heaviness in the way she reached for my hand. "Sarah," she whispered. "Do you remember the blue box?" I frowned. "What blue box?" "In the study," she said. "Top shelf. Your father's." I tried to remember, sifting through the images of the bookshelves, the stacks of papers, the drawers I hadn't opened. A blue box. It hadn't stood out to me the night before. "What's in it?" I asked. She shook her head slightly. "Important things. Don't let Daniel," her voice trailed off, her strength giving out. She closed her eyes for a moment, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. I squeezed her hand. "I'll find it, Mom. I promise." Her lips curved in the faintest smile before sleep pulled her under. When I left the hospital, Daniel was waiting in the corridor. His arms were crossed, his tie loosened. He looked at me like he was already tired of whatever I might say. "What did she tell you?" he asked. I hesitated, the memory of her fragile whisper still fresh. "She just wanted to know if I'd been to the house." He studied me for a long moment, eyes narrowing. Don't encourage her. It's not healthy. She has the right to talk about him, I said, my voice low. Daniel's jaw tightened. This isn't about rights. It's about her health. Stop bringing him up. I turned and walked away before he could see the fury rising in me. But inside, I was already planning. That night, I went back to the house. This time, I brought a flashlight and a step stool. In the study, I climbed carefully, my hands shaking as I reached for the higher shelves. Dust fell onto my face, stinging my eyes, but then I saw it, wedged behind a stack of old encyclopedias. A battered blue box, its corners frayed, its lid slightly askew. I pulled it down and set it on the desk. My heart pounded as I lifted the lid. Inside were envelopes, yellowed with age, tied neatly with string. Beneath them, a leather-bound journal with Dad's handwriting etched across the cover. I touched the letters with trembling fingers. The first envelope I opened held a letter addressed to Mom. The handwriting was familiar, bold, slanted, alive. He had written about the day I was born, about his hopes, about how scared he was to be a father. I had never seen this side of him in words, never read his private fears and love. Tears blurred my vision as I folded the letter back carefully. In the journal, page after page was filled with notes, sketches, clippings. Observations about the world, about family, about us. He had written about Daniel, too. About how proud he was of his discipline, how he worried that his ambition would harden him. And about me, how he saw my softness as strength, even when I doubted it. I closed the journal gently, holding it to my chest. This was what Daniel wanted erased. Not just the name, not just the man, but the proof of his humanity. The evidence that he had been more than the mistakes, more than the complications. I stayed in that room for hours, reading, crying, recording my voice alongside his words. I spoke aloud into my phone, documenting what I found, preserving it before it could be hidden or destroyed. The next day, Daniel called again. We need to make a decision about the house, he said. I've already spoken to a realtor. My breath caught. You did what? It's the sensible option. The longer we wait, the harder it'll be. You didn't even ask Mom, I said sharply. She's not in a position to. She's in every position to, I cut in. And she wants to keep Dad's things. She told me. There was a pause on the line, then his voice, colder than before. Sarah. Stop this. You're making it harder than it needs to be. No, I said quietly. You are. I hung up before he could answer. My hands shook, but my chest felt lighter. Later, when I visited Mom, I slipped the journal into her lap. Her eyes widened as she traced the cover, her fingers trembling. You found it, she whispered. I nodded. He wrote about everything. About you. About us. She opened it slowly, tears filling her eyes as she read. I sat beside her, watching her lips move silently over the words. For the first time in weeks, she looked not just alive, but whole. When Daniel arrived half an hour later, his smile faltered the moment he saw the journal. What is that? He demanded. Mom clutched it tighter to her chest. It's your father's, she said firmly, her voice carrying a strength I hadn't heard in years. And it stays. Daniel's face hardened, but he didn't argue. Not in front of her. But I saw it in his eyes. This wasn't over. That night, I made another recording, my voice steady this time. He's trying to erase you, Dad. But we won't let him. Not as long as I'm here. The recorder captured my vow, the hum of the night air, the sound of my determination settling in. For the first time, I wasn't just reacting. I was fighting back. The night after Mom held Dad's journal in her lap, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the way Daniel's expression shifted when he saw it, not sadness, not nostalgia, but anger. The kind of anger that came from losing control. He hadn't expected Mom to remember. He hadn't expected me to dig. And now that I had, he would tighten his grip on everything else. In the morning, my phone buzzed again with a message from him: "We need to meet. Tonight." I didn't reply. Instead, I poured myself a cup of coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and read another of Dad's letters. This one wasn't addressed to anyone, just a loose page slipped between the journal entries. His handwriting was messy, as if he had written in a rush. I know I've disappointed them sometimes. I know I'm not easy to love. But I hope they remember the mornings I made pancakes, the nights I stayed up fixing the car, the times I tried. I hope they see more than my flaws. The paper blurred as my tears fell onto it. I wiped them away carefully, folding the page back into the journal. My throat tightened. That hope, the hope of being remembered as more than mistakes, it was the very thing Daniel was trying to deny him. By evening, I found myself driving to the cafe Daniel had suggested. It was the kind of place he liked, modern, sterile, full of people tapping on laptops as though they were all rehearsing for job interviews. He was already there, sitting straight-backed, his tie loosened just enough to appear casual but not truly relaxed. "You're making this difficult," he said as soon as I sat down. No greeting, no warmth. I stared at him, waiting. The journal. The house. All of it. "You're clinging to things that don't matter anymore." "They matter to Mom," I said. "They're upsetting her," he countered. "Do you want her to spend her last years stuck in the past? Reliving pain?" "She's not reliving pain. She's remembering love." He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "You don't know what you're talking about. You were always his favorite. You never saw the other side." The words stung, but I kept my face steady. "And what about you? You saw only his flaws. You refused to admit he was more than that." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "I'm protecting Mom." I shook my head. "No. You're protecting yourself." The silence between us stretched, thick with things we couldn't say in public. I reached into my bag, my fingers brushing against my phone. The recordings were there, his demand in the waiting room, his insistence at the lawyer's office, his attempt to silence me now. But I didn't pull it out. Not yet. Instead, I stood. "I'm not letting you erase him, Daniel. Not from Mom's life. Not from mine." His jaw tightened, but he didn't stop me as I walked out. When I visited Mom the next day, she looked tired again, though her hand still rested on the journal at her bedside. She smiled faintly when she saw me. "Your brother's upset," she said softly. "I know," I replied, sitting beside her. She reached for my hand, her grip surprisingly firm. "Don't let him bully you." For a moment, I saw her as she once was, sharp, strong, the woman who could silence a room with one look. Age and illness had worn her down, but that fire still flickered in her eyes. "I won't," I promised. Later, as I was leaving, Daniel arrived. We passed in the doorway, his eyes cold, his lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't speak to me, and I didn't stop. But I knew the battle lines had been drawn. That night, I returned to the house again. This time, I opened more drawers, sifted through boxes, searched for whatever else Dad might have left behind. In one drawer of the desk, I found a small cassette tape, unlabeled, tucked beneath a stack of old tax documents. I held it up to the light, my pulse quickening. Back at home, I dug out an old player from the attic and slid the tape in. After a few moments of static, his voice filled the room. "Testing, testing, all right." He chuckled softly. "If anyone ever finds this, maybe it's Sarah. Or maybe it's no one. Doesn't matter. I just need to say this somewhere." I froze, my breath caught in my chest. I know I wasn't perfect. God knows I wasn't. But I loved my kids. I loved them fiercely. If they remember nothing else, I hope they remember that. I hope Daniel knows it, even if he doesn't believe it. The tape clicked off, silence rushing in like a tide. I sat there for a long time, the player still humming faintly, my hands trembling. Dad's voice, raw and unpolished, was proof. Proof he had loved us both. Proof that Daniel's cold dismissal wasn't the full truth. I replayed it, recording the sound on my phone so I could keep it safe. And then I knew, I wasn't just gathering keepsakes. I was gathering evidence. Evidence against erasure. The following week, tension seeped into every visit with Mom. Daniel arrived with flowers, with fruit, with his carefully measured smiles. I arrived with the journal, the letters, the small stories she asked me to remind her of. She always asked me, never him. And every time, I saw the irritation simmering beneath his polished surface. Finally, one evening, it broke. We were both in the hospital room when Mom asked about the house. "What will happen to it?" she whispered, her eyes flicking between us. Daniel straightened, ready with his answer. "We'll sell it, Mom. It's too much work." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't want it sold." Daniel faltered, just slightly. "Mom, be reasonable." No, her voice was firm, more force than I'd heard in months. "It's your father's house. It stays." I felt a surge of relief, of pride, as she clutched the journal to her chest. Daniel's face darkened. He opened his mouth, but Mom cut him off again. "You think you know what's best. But you don't know what it means to hold on to someone. To remember." The silence afterward was suffocating. Daniel sat back, his jaw clenched, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. I reached for Mom's hand, and she squeezed mine weakly. When we left the room later, Daniel turned on me in the hallway. His voice was low, seething. "You've poisoned her against me." I met his glare without flinching. "No. She remembers for herself. You just don't want to face it." He leaned in closer, his breath sharp. "You're going to regret this." I held his gaze. "Not as much as you'll regret forgetting him." We walked in opposite directions, the corridor echoing with our footsteps, the weight of unspoken truths pressing down. That night, I replayed Dad's tape again. His voice filled the room, warm and flawed and real. I pressed record once more, whispering into my phone, "They can try to silence you, Dad. But your voice still lives." For the first time, I felt the balance shifting. The fight was no longer just mine. It was Dad's too. The tape stayed with me everywhere I went. I slipped it into my bag like it was a passport, proof of an identity that no one could deny. Sometimes, when the world felt too heavy, I'd play the recording quietly through headphones, just to hear Dad's voice again. Each word was imperfect, halting, but it carried something Daniel couldn't bury, the sound of love. But love wasn't enough to silence the growing battle. A week after that hallway confrontation, Daniel called another family meeting. This time it wasn't at the lawyer's office or the hospital. He insisted we meet at the house itself. I almost laughed at the irony, but I agreed. When I arrived, the house was lit up in a way it hadn't been in months. Daniel had clearly been there earlier, opening curtains, switching on lamps, making it look less like a mausoleum and more like a property listing. He was standing in the living room when I walked in, arms crossed, expression tight. "This has gone far enough," he said without preamble. I dropped my bag on the couch. "I agree." He blinked, caught off guard, before narrowing his eyes. "You're clinging to scraps. To dusty books and old tapes. It's pathetic." "They're not scraps," I shot back. "They're our father's life." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Our father was not the saint you remember. You think I want to erase him because I'm cruel? No. I want to erase him because I lived with the worst of him. The words landed like stones. I had known, of course, that Daniel and Dad had clashed. I remembered the slammed doors, the raised voices, the nights Dad sat on the porch smoking alone while Daniel's room burned with silence. But hearing him say it now, sharp and bitter, tore through me. "What do you mean?" I asked carefully. Daniel's eyes flicked away, just for a second, before he looked back at me. "You were the favorite, Sarah. You got the pancakes and the bedtime stories. I got the lectures, the punishments, the disappointment. He never thought I was enough. And when I tried harder, when I did everything right, it still wasn't enough." I stared at him, my throat dry. "He loved you." He laughed, a hollow sound. "If that was love, I don't want it." Silence filled the room. The clock ticked on the wall, the sound absurdly loud. I thought of the tape, of Dad's voice saying he hoped Daniel knew he was loved. I wanted to pull it out, press play, force him to hear it. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I said softly, "Maybe he didn't show it the way you needed. But erasing him won't fix that." Daniel shook his head. "You don't get it. This house, these things, they're anchors. They keep us chained to a man who never deserved it." I felt anger flare, but underneath it, sorrow. He wasn't just fighting me. He was fighting the ghost of a father he could never forgive. "Then maybe," I said slowly, "you're not trying to erase him for Mom's sake. Maybe you're doing it for yours." Daniel's face hardened, but he didn't deny it. The conversation ended without resolution. He stormed out, leaving the lights blazing behind him. I stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by Dad's presence, and felt both the weight of memory and the ache of Daniel's bitterness pressing against me. That night, I brought the journal to Mom again. She turned the pages slowly, her fingers lingering on every line. At one point, she looked up at me, her eyes sharp despite her frailty. "Your brother, he carries things he won't say. Don't hate him for it." I swallowed hard. "I don't hate him, Mom. I just hate what he's trying to do." She closed the journal gently. "Your father was hard on him." I tried to soften it, but they were too alike. Stubborn, proud. He wanted Daniel to be strong, but Daniel only felt judged. That wound doesn't heal easily. Her words pierced me. I had spent so long defending Dad that I hadn't allowed myself to see the truth of what Daniel carried. It didn't excuse his attempts to erase, but it explained them. When Daniel arrived later that evening, I stayed in the room. I didn't leave like before. I sat beside Mom as he spoke about doctors and plans and practicalities. His words were smooth, but his eyes flickered when they landed on the journal at her side. Finally, I took a deep breath and pulled out my phone. "There's something you need to hear," I said. Daniel's gaze sharpened. "Sarah." But I pressed play before he could stop me. Dad's voice filled the room, grainy but unmistakable. "I know I wasn't perfect. God knows I wasn't. But I loved my kids. I loved them fiercely. If they remember nothing else, I hope they remember that. I hope Daniel knows it, even if he doesn't believe it." The room went silent. Mom's eyes filled with tears. My own throat closed up as the words played out again. Daniel froze. His face drained of color, his jaw working silently. He turned away, gripping the edge of the chair so tightly his knuckles whitened. For once, he had no words. When the recording ended, the silence pressed down like a weight. Finally, Mom spoke, her voice trembling. "He did love you, Daniel. You just couldn't see it." Daniel stood abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. "This is manipulation," he spat. But his voice cracked, betraying him. Without another word, he stormed out of the room. I sat there shaking, unsure if I had won anything or only pushed him further away. Mom squeezed my hand weakly. "He'll need time," she whispered. That night, alone at home, I replayed the tape again. But this time, I didn't just hear Dad's voice. I heard the silence after, the silence that Daniel couldn't fill with denial. The silence where the truth finally broke through his walls. For the first time, I wondered if this fight wasn't about saving Dad's memory for Mom or for me. Maybe it was about saving it for Daniel, too, even if he didn't want it. The days that followed were strained. Daniel avoided me, his texts curt, his visits to Mom carefully timed so we wouldn't overlap. But I noticed something: he didn't mention selling the house again. He didn't try to take the journal away. He didn't forbid Dad's name. It was a small shift, fragile, but it was something. And yet, I knew the battle wasn't finished. The weight of years couldn't be undone by a single recording. There would be another confrontation, another reckoning. I just didn't know when. The last time I visited Mom in the hospital, the room was quiet except for the steady beep of the monitor and the soft rustle of her breathing. The journal rested on her lap, her hand splayed across the cover like a guardian. She didn't need to say anything. I could see it in the way her fingers lingered there, the way her shoulders loosened every time she touched the pages. She looked up when I entered, her eyes tired but clear. "Your brother came earlier," she said. "Oh?" I asked, bracing myself. He didn't say much. Just sat with me. I read him a passage from the journal, the one where your father wrote about him building that birdhouse when he was 12. "Do you remember?" I smiled faintly. "I remember the birdhouse collapsing the first time the wind hit it." Mom chuckled softly. "Your father wrote that it was crooked and shaky, but he'd never been prouder." I think Daniel needed to hear that. The image caught me off guard. My brother, sitting stiffly in that chair, listening to words he probably never believed existed. Maybe it had slipped past his defenses. Maybe not. But at least the words were spoken aloud. That evening, when I walked into the house, Daniel's car was already in the driveway. For a moment, I considered leaving, circling the block until he was gone. But something in me said it was time. He was in the study when I entered, standing by the shelves. His tie was loosened, his sleeves rolled up, but his posture was still rigid. He didn't look at me right away. "She read me that page," he said finally. His voice was quieter than I'd expected. I didn't remember it like that. I stepped closer. "How did you remember it?" He shrugged, his eyes on the spines of the books. I remembered him yelling because I bent the nails. I remembered him fixing what I'd done wrong. That was all. "Maybe it was both," I said gently. "The frustration and the pride." For the first time in weeks, he turned to face me. His eyes were rimmed red, though his expression was still guarded. "You don't understand. You had a different father than I did." "I believe you," I said. "But that doesn't mean he didn't love you. He just didn't know how to show it in a way you could see." Daniel's lips pressed together, his jaw working. He looked away again, staring at the desk where the blue box still Saturday. "I don't want this house." "I know," I said. "It feels like a museum of all the things I hated." I took a deep breath. "And to me, it feels like proof of all the things I loved." Maybe it doesn't have to be just one or the other. The silence stretched, heavy but not hostile. For the first time, I sensed that he wasn't fighting me anymore. He was fighting himself. Finally, he let out a long breath. "I won't push Mom about selling it. Not while she's here." Relief washed over me, though I knew better than to smile. "Thank you," I said simply. We didn't hug. We didn't reconcile with dramatic words. But something in the air shifted, not forgiveness, not closure, but a fragile truce. A week later, Mom was discharged. She insisted on going home, even if only for a little while. Daniel and I stood together in the doorway as she stepped into the house, her hand brushing the wall like it was greeting her back. She walked straight to the study, to the desk, and sat down in Dad's old chair. "This is where I belong," she whispered. Daniel and I stood behind her, silent, both of us carrying our own truths. He saw the weight, I saw the warmth, but for once, we didn't argue. We let her sit in peace, surrounded by the remnants of a man who had been flawed and fierce, harsh and loving, absent and present, all at once. That night, after she had gone to bed, I sat alone in the kitchen. I took out my phone and scrolled through the recordings, Daniel's demand in the waiting room, Mom's whispers about the blue box, Dad's voice on the tape. Proof, evidence, memory. One by one, I deleted them. Not because they didn't matter, but because they had already done their work. The truth wasn't in the files. It was here, in the journal on Mom's lap, in the silence Daniel couldn't deny, in the fragile threads holding us together. I set the phone down and whispered aloud, the way I had so many nights before, "Dad." This time, though, it didn't feel like defiance. It felt like acknowledgement. Like release. And for the first time, I understood that remembering wasn't about fighting Daniel, or proving myself, or even clinging to objects. It was about carrying the fullness of who Dad was, the good, the bad, the messy, and letting it live quietly in me. The house creaked softly in the night, as though agreeing.